Um, Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for Bessie for the invitation to come and speak to you all today. Um, I have something of a unwarranted reputation in the behavioral science community when it comes to sludge, insofar as I just happened to write a paper about it quite early on, and it's the sort of discussion we were having, and it's kind of followed me around since. And whether that's like a sludgy effect, I don't know, but that is my relationship to the concept. Um, from an environmental perspective, I think it's quite interesting that my main work does focus in technology, and I am probably more, well, I'm certainly more an economist than a psychologist, but whether that's a good thing is a different question. But this is, I'd say, my typical background has not actually been in environmental work. But I've had the opportunity to work with some quite brilliant people. Most of what I'm going to talk to you about today comes from a paper that I co-wrote with Ganga Sridhar and Cahill Moran, um, two great researchers who are more proactively engaged in the question of behavioral science and environmental economics. And I think personally, but I think everyone is starting to clock on to this stuff is really, really important. And it's certainly becoming a larger theme of my work. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all today. Um, I trust that my slide then changed. If it didn't, I'm sure someone will shout at me. Um, Going first, and we're talking about this concept of behavioral sludge today. It seems prudent to introduce the concept. And really, the first formalization of the idea of sludge we find in a paper Richard Thaler wrote in 2018. It's an interesting paper. It's quite an accessible paper. I recommend anyone interested pick it up and read it. It's quite short. And in that paper, Thaler broadly says, well, behavioral sludge is friction that gets in the way of us doing what we want. It's some sort of behavioral design, some sort of behavioral science or choice architecture design that makes it harder for us to achieve our goals. Um, that was an interesting idea. It got picked up, it got developed. I think it got developed in the best way by Leo and his colleagues. They liken sludge to essentially being transaction costs which come from choice architecture. Now, to not get too deep into it, transaction costs is an economic idea. It essentially says what are the costs, both financial and non-financial, that person might have to incur as they try and make choices, as they purchase goods or services and so on. So, for example, a typical transaction cost would be a search cost. Say you're trying to find a product on a shelf, there may be dozens and dozens of those products. There are search costs involved because you have to figure out, well, where on the shelf is the product I want, or which of these dozen products is the particular one that I want. And that takes up time, it might take up psychological energy. We see these sort of costs all over the place. I put on the screen that my research is in online design, and search costs are a frequent characteristic of online design, online choice architecture. So that's what sludge is. It's kind of choice architecture that creates transaction costs, which makes decision making, makes pursuing what you want to do a little bit harder, or sometimes quite a lot harder. What myself, Ganga, and Cahill started thinking about is there any sort of exception when it comes to pro-environmental behaviours, or what are broadly called green behaviours? And can sludge explain something which we often see in environmental economics and in broad surveys of environmental attitudes, which is people typically want to be greener, they want to be more sustainable, people do care about environmentalism. But yeah, when you look at the choices people actually make, the behaviors they actually exhibit, the lifestyle changes that people have slowly been making, what we typically see is their attitudes, their revealed not revealed preferences, their reported preferences differ from their revealed preferences, differ from what people actually do. And for us as behavioral people, that raises an interesting question of, well, what is getting in the way? What is stopping a person from choosing the options which they claim that they would like to pursue? And that's a classic behavioral science question. And so we started to think, well, maybe there's some degree of sludge involved. Maybe there are common frictions in green behaviors which are getting in the way and preventing people from pursuing the choices and the lives that they want to lead. And we developed this concept of brown sludge to articulate this particular type of sludge, the sludge involved in green behaviours. And we originally called it green sludge because that's just how we intuitively thought about it. And I can take credit for this. One day I pointed out to them, well, green sludge is like sludge which stops you being pro-environmental. What we're talking about is the opposite. So that's where the phrase brown sludge came from. And trying to formalize this idea of brown sludge, we looked at various levels of behavior and I'd say environments in which people interact and thus behavior emerges. So on an individual level, we can talk about essentially things that obfuscate product selection. Things like vague eco-level labels, vague packaging, which perhaps appeals to the ideas of being pro-environmental without necessarily being so. Greenwashed messaging. I'm aware that greenwashing and marketing and sort of public communications and all stuff related to greenwashing is a very, very broad area. We don't get into it too much, but we would suggest that greenwashing from an individual perspective does count as a kind of sludge. Or because these things impose higher search costs, they increase the amount of time it takes for you to understand the products that you're buying and the true environmental impact of those products. And it can create psychological costs through reducing trust. And of course, increases evaluation costs. You have to take the time to figure out what sort of signals, what information that you're being given is actually reliable. So, for instance, the two logos on the screen here, one is the Fair Trade logo, and another one is the Rainforest Alliance logo. These are quite common, quite famous logos. If you actually look into what these organizations do, I'm not going to be too critical, but most of what they do is not necessarily promoting a pro-environmental agenda. But I guess most of the time, if you saw these kind of logos, you generally associate that product with being, sustainable, environmentally positive, but not necessarily. And that will complicate how you evaluate products. And so, yeah, the impact is it delays behavior change. It tricks people into making choices which aren't actually as green as they think it is. And the remedies are probably things like clear disclosures of carbon impact, for instance. So we have calorie labels. There's evidence that clear calorie labels are quite effective. Let's try and implement clear carbon labels. That would probably have a similar effect. Also standardizing eco labels and having third-party verification. So rather than every organization inventing their own label to say, look how brilliant we are, you actually have industry standards and you have incentives that mean that if you get that label, someone has actually genuinely verified your credentials. Next, we talk at the social level. Yeah. So I thought I said societal for a second. We talk at the social level about how do we have conversations about pro-environmental behaviours and the way information gets communicated throughout society about what actually is a good thing to do for the environment versus what is a less positive thing to do. So in the paper, we talk about things like the carbon footprint, how that was actually quite a clever marketing technique, and thinking about your carbon footprint is not necessarily the most helpful way of thinking about your impact on the environment. But we also talk about potentially controversially things like misinformation and disinformation campaigns on social media. We talk about something called discourses of denial, which is often where green behavior or environmental impact is twisted or warped. So it's not necessarily about what you primarily think it should be, say carbon emissions. It becomes about things like plastic in the ocean, or it becomes things about driving less or electric vehicles. Things generally in the cluster of sustainability and green behavior, but now it's a more vague concept, and thus it's perhaps harder to push through effective behavior change. Another famous example, we get this less in Europe, but it's a big one in America, things like the Clean Coal Initiative, which is just an oxymoron. It's pushed by a PR organization for the coal lobby. But it obfuscates the conversation about, well, what actually is a good resource to generate energy from, what isn't. And again, the transaction costs, search costs. In this case, we get greater uncertainty. And at the social level, we emphasize things like peer pressure and social costs. If there is disagreement about what actually is pro-environmental and what isn't, you probably don't want to have an argument with your friends. You probably don't want to lecture your parents or your spouse about how they're doing something that's not very good for the environment. You probably just want to kind of move on from the conversation, and that allows these behaviors to persist. And the remedies here, we suggest effective science communication, deliberative public engagement. We think this is important when you look at things like citizens panels. A lot of pro-environmental groups talk about citizen engagement and local decision making. And perhaps from a behavioral science perspective, we could talk about strategies like disinformation inoculation. I don't know too much about inoculation theory, but it is a big thing in the misinformation space. And the last sort of level on which we think about brown sludge is in the institutional level. And perhaps feels odd that this comes last because a lot of the examples we talk about at the institutional level are more common examples of sludge in the literature. But here we're talking about bureaucratic delays, unclear instructions, inconsistent incentives, duplication of requirements. It's all the classic stuff that Liz was facing when she talks about getting solar panels installed. What's interesting, or what I'll highlight, is things like duplication of requirements. A lot of new green initiatives which governments are introducing, which I'm not going to criticize, they kind of get bolted on top of previous brown or fossil fuel based initiatives without consciously thinking that, well, this is creating perhaps excess paperwork, it's creating perhaps a system that is difficult to navigate. And that completely unintentionally is perhaps holding back some adoption of green initiatives just because the policies are designed and implemented in a less than accessible way. And again, transaction costs involved are high search costs, unnecessary time costs, and a degree of outcome uncertainty. We looked at a few schemes to try and promote green grants for retrofitting buildings to promote energy efficiency, and also some grants around building, say, renewables in a local area, so say a local wind turbine or local solar farm. A lot of the policies we looked at, they were not blanket grants. There was a degree of uncertainty about how much money you might get, whether you would get money, when you would find out. All of those things affect how you can plan these investments and potentially disincentivize pursuing greener investments compared to more traditional stuff. And this is again the impact. It delays, it disincentivizes people to pursue these policies. We say it encourages pursuing locally optimal policies, by which we mean today, right now, is easier to just build a house in the way that we have always built a house than it is to build a house that is super energy efficient, because building it how we have always built it is the locally optimal way to go. Everything is set up to support traditional construction rather than green construction. And the remedies here are very classic sludge busting mechanisms. It's things like simplifying processes, sludge auditing to actually understand how your processes work, and aligning policy incentives with stakeholder objectives. I won't get into this too much, but there's some interesting incentive stuff around, say, investing in rental properties, who bears the costs, and that influences, well, whether someone would actually want to invest. Now, one of the interesting things about the paper, and I think one of the more controversial things, I think Leo might even agree that this is a bit controversial, is when we're talking about pro-environmental behavior, when we're talking about trying to solve big environmental problems, it's probably wrong to suggest that all of the reasons why we continue to not prioritize green behaviors is simply because there is friction in the way. And actually, if we got rid of that friction or reform the system, we would all be super sustainable. There are, in many instances where it comes to pro-environmental behavior, substantial incentives and barriers in the way of people pursuing things that in an ideal world they would want to do. For instance, you might want to cycle to work every day. You might not want to have to drive. But if the cycle lanes don't exist, or if the roads are clogged with traffic and they're really, really dangerous, you are not in a position to pursue the choices that you want to pursue. But that's not because of choice architecture. That's not because of transaction costs. That's because of a lack of infrastructure, a lack of investment. And these things are important factors. And from a behavioral science perspective, it is important that we recognize when these ideas are relevant and when they're not relevant. A great example of this is to look at the Gilets jaunes protests in France from a few years ago. It started as a generally pro-environmental policy of we're going to raise tax on petrol and diesel to try and discourage driving. Great, fine, whatever. Unfortunately, the public transport infrastructure hadn't been put in place, and many of the people who drove and who were affected by this tax were at the lower end of the income distribution. So rather than having an effect of getting everyone on board with driving electric cars or just not driving, it sparked massive protests because lots of people were saying, a car is the only way I can get to my job. I am locked into a driving infrastructure. And that's not something that gets solved with, simplifying a process or using a nudge to get rid of some sludge. We have to think about the brown infrastructure involved when it comes to behavior change. And lastly, before I wrap up, I'd say if we ignore brown infrastructure as an aspect of this conversation, behavioral science potentially harms itself because it potentially begins to advocate solutions which most policymakers in the room will doubt or will know will not ultimately work. So hopefully something I've said today is interesting. Hopefully I've given a fair and balanced assessment of how these behavioral science tools can work. And I appreciate you taking the time to listen to me today.